The third dimension, and this is where Josephine and Sharon and I had very different trainings and came at it differently. Their training was primarily in the tradition of Mahasi Sayadaw Pandita, was these first two levels. And the second level, as you saw things, led to a deeper detachment, and in some cases, the cessation of either your sense of yourself or of the world in the way you knew it, or consciousness dropping away. It turns out there are different flavors of cessation.
Mm-hmm.
The third dimension is this. Ajahn Chah and the monks of the forest tradition, a number of them, teach this way. He had practiced for 10 years as a meditator in the caves and the jungles, ardently going through all kinds of difficulties, and then developing deep concentration, dissolving his body into light, going into jhana and samadhi states, having deep insights. And then he went to see the greatest master of the day, another Ajahn or teacher named Ajahn Mun,
Mm-hmm.
reported all of his experiences and said, "Give me some advice." And the master looked at him and said, "Cha, you've missed the point. Those are just experiences. They're like movies on a screen. There's a war movie and a documentary and a romantic comedy, and a children's movie." He said, "Those appear and disappear, the most exalted states or the most painful ones, but the only real question is, to whom do they happen? So turn your attention back from the screen to the one who knows." He used the Pali word sikibuto,
Mm.
and become the knowing itself. Look into consciousness itself. And when you become the knowing, which is timeless, unborn, not related to yourself as an individual, but the nature of consciousness itself, there you will really find liberation. And from that awareness, then, you can live in the world, but you live in the world in a very different way, because you live from the place of freedom and consciousness rather than being entangled in things. So that's very close to Dzogchen
Yeah.
and practice. And maybe I told you there was this wonderful dialogue between one of our forest masters, Ajahn Jumnian, and Soni Rinpoche, a
Oh, no,
great
I didn't hear that.
Dzogchen master. And I was the translator for it at
Mm.
Spirit Rock. And it was, I'm just riffing now. Is this
Yeah,
okay?
this is great.
And so here we are. And they were talking about the deeper levels of their teaching. And I need to make a little caveat here, because level 1, 2, and 3 that I just talked about is not hierarchical.
Mm.
They're different dimensions of freedom. You get freedom by being able to tolerate and be with the content of your experience. You get freedom also by seeing that it's impermanent and selfless. You can't grasp it. You get freedom when you shift back to being the knowing. But even so, you need the freedom to be able to be with the content of experience, to see the way things are. So anyway, there they were. And I knew that neither had heard the other tradition's way of approaching the deeper perspectives of meditation. So Ajahn Chumdian presented first, and he said, after I teach people to sit, after they have some level of ethics, so that it's very hard to meditate after a day of killing and stealing.
Okay.
It doesn't work that well.
Yeah.
But after they have established some modicum of ethics, and they sit and they learn to quiet their mind and become present for their experience, those first layers, and so forth, then I direct them to what he called Mahavipassana, or great Vipassana. Sometimes he would say, you practice this by seeing from the from the brow chakra, from the third eye. He would talk about that. But he said what it means is to shift from the content of experience to direct your attention back and become consciousness itself. And the nature of consciousness, he went on, is unborn and undying. It is transparent and luminous. It has nothing to do with self, and yet you are also, self arises within it in its tentative form. And he gave his instructions of pointing to that, of how people could practice in that way. Sogni Rinpoche listened to him And I asked him, I said, so can you give some instructions to Ajahn Jumnian of how you would do this? And he gave some sort of modified or simple, what Tibetans call pointing out instructions, and so forth, looking into the nature of mind. And they laughed and they looked at each other and said, we're teaching the same thing. So there was that.
Yeah.
Then it got more interesting because Sodi Rinpoche said, yeah, but in Tibet, they give us Dzogchenpas, or Dzogchen teachers and non-dual teachers, some of the other traditions give us a really hard time because they say what we're teaching is something like the reification of consciousness, like Atman and Brahman, and that there's something there, and it's really some modified version of Hinduism.
It's making a something of
making a something out
the
of
underlying
the
reality of consciousness.
And the people who are the most vociferous critics are the followers of Nagarjuna, who deconstructs everything.
Yeah.
Even the conversation we're having now would be deconstructed phrase by phrase into nothingness. So, and Ajahn Chumnian laughed. He said, oh, yeah, we got the same problem. He said, though they say the texts, say that consciousness arises with its object, and we're teaching something that's wrong according to the Buddha's teachings, and they have their textual background. So he said, so how do you answer them? And Ajahn Chumnian said, consciousness has two different dimensions. And in this way, I will add, it's a little bit like light, which has both a wave and particle nature, which baffled physicists at first. But then they realized that we have to actually hold this paradox of reality. And consciousness has the same paradox, that observed in one way, it's discrete. There's a moment of seeing or hearing or smelling or tasting, and the consciousness or knowing that arises with it. This Ajahn Chumnian explained. But when consciousness is not identified with the experience, then it shifts from being particle-like arising in the moment to being the field of consciousness within which everything arises and from which everything comes. So they had this dialogue of this kind that I don't know ever happened in the Buddhist world before.
Yeah.
And it partially answers your question because I carried both Mahasi Sayadaw's lineage and Ajahn Chah's teaching. And Joseph and Sharon, at least initially, mostly carried the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition. Later, they too practiced in Dzogchen and so forth.
Well, that's fascinating. It's that will all be very